It all started with a yard sale. That's not really where most stories start, but it is where mine really begins. The elderly man who lived across the street from where I did was selling a lot of items for really cheap. While I hadn't had much to do with him, I knew that his name was Nate Miller. I also knew that around 6 months before, his wife had vanished from his life. I didn't know if something had happened to him or if she had left him. All I knew was that she was gone, and it had broken his heart. The sale that Nate was having was to get rid of most of the belongings of his wife. I guess that meant that he was trying to move on. I guess before I move on with my story, I should explain something. When the events that I am currently talking about took place, my name was Zach Swan. I might even have considered myself as a normal 20-something-year-old guy, except for the fact that I liked to dress up as a mature woman named Barbara. As well as dressing as her, I also dreamed of becoming an old woman for real. Seeing Nate was selling a lot of clothing as well as other items that were more suitable for an older woman, and seeing he was selling them cheaply, his yard sale was great for me. Due to the fact there were so many items that I wanted to buy, I had grabbed a large box. I had loaded it with dresses, skirts, tops, lingerie and even some cosmetics I had found. Having stumbled on a set of rather large and new-looking realistic false breasts, I was about to add them to my box when Nate stepped up in front of me. "I'm sorry to pry," Nate said, as I stood there a little worried. "But I knew your parents, and I know they don't live here anymore. So these items you are picking out don't seem like the kind of thing that a young man like yourself would be interested in." I quickly worked out that Nate's mention of my parents was his way of letting me know not to lie by saying they were for my mother. Knowing that route was cut off, I decided to be honest. "I am buying for myself," I stated. "Is there a problem with that?" For a moment, Nate seemed dazed. I would even go so far as to say that he looked totally confused. Oh, Nate said at last. "I see. Very well, carry on, and when you are done, come see me at the front for a price." That was just what I ended up doing. Truth be told, I was hoping to find some sort of jewelry. Sadly, there was none to be found. Either it wasn't for sale, there wasn't any, or someone else had beaten me to it. When I was done, and I had found everything I wanted to buy, I took my box to where Nate was waiting. Having handed it to him, he only took a quick look at it before he named a single price for everything. Seeing the single price was much cheaper than I had expected to pay, I quickly handed the money over and walked away. It was around 2 weeks after the yard sale that things got a little weird. As I said before, I liked dressing up as an old woman. It was something I did whenever I could. I even often went out shopping as Barbara, and always had a good time doing it. Something I have to admit that added to the enjoyment was getting to wear the corsets that I had gotten at the yard sale. I just loved how they felt around my body. I digress. This isn't about my dressing habits. This was about the events of that night. Just as I got home, Nate did the same. The one difference was that I was walking and he was in his car. As he backed his car into his carport, his headlights happened to shine on me. He quickly turned them off, but I was left too stunned to move. As Nate got out of his car, I noticed some things about him. One of them was that dressed in the suit as well as the tie that he was wearing and with the hat he had on his head, he looked as if he was a reporter out of a 1940s comic. The other thing I noticed was the totally stunned look on his face as he looked at me. Getting over the shock of the headlights, I quickly rushed into my house. With my high heels clacking up the path, I hoped once I was inside, I would be safe. I hoped that Noah would forget what he had seen and that would be the end of the matter. It wasn't. Around 5 days later, Noah knocked on my door. One of the first things he told me was that he thought I made a very attractive older woman. That caused me to blush, and yet at the same time, it made me a little nervous. "I was hoping," Noah said as I stood there. "That is to say, next week I have this week-long fishing trip with my buddies and their wives." "Okay?" I responded, as I wasn't sure where this conversation was going. "So, I don't want to be the oddball that is going alone. That's why I wanted to speak to you." "About what?" "When I saw you the other night, and I saw how lovely you looked. Well, I thought you might be the answer." "The answer?" "I'd like to ask for your help. Would you pretend to be my elderly girlfriend for the week of the fishing trip?" The moment that Nate said those words, I knew that the whole idea excited me greatly. "Well," Nate said, "I guess that hinges on if you can sound the part. If you can, I will give you access to some other items that belong to Candace. To my former wife, which will help you carry the part." "I would love to help you, Han," I responded in the mature female voice that it had taken me years to work out how to do. When Nate heard that voice, his eyes nearly popped out of his head. Soon after that, he started to smile. It was a few days after I had agreed to be Nate's pretend girlfriend, Barbara, that he came good on what he promised. On that day, I was given access to Candace's jewelry. Over the years she had amassed a lot of rings and other things, so those that fitted me or I felt suited me, went on my body. When I was done, I had some rings on my fingers much like she had. I also had golden earrings hanging from my ears, some bracelets around my wrists, and of course a necklace. There was a part of me that deeply hoped that I would have access to her engagement ring and wedding band, but sadly, that wasn't the case. I could totally see why. I was the girlfriend, not anything more, so the rings would have seemed out of place. It was soon after the jewelry had been applied that Nate asked me a question I never thought he would. "So if it's not a rude question," Nate asked, "how did your skin end up the way it is?" "You mean leathery and old-looking?" I asked. "Well, to put it that way, yes. My mother had this thing for tanning. She wanted to be the most tanned woman around. She also wanted me to be tanned like her. That was why I was homeschooled, so we would never miss a day of sun." "And your father was all right with this?" "Oh yes, he liked her like that." "And that led to you being how you are?" "Yes. As I said before, she made me tan in the same way she did. She even applied the same mixtures to me that she applied to herself. They were meant to help us get a better tan. I'm not sure if they worked. All I know is that over the years, as her skin turned brown and leathery, so did mine." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear." "Don't be. It's not so bad. I mean, when I am pretending to be a young man, I can cover my skin and make it look more like it should for a person of my age. Plus, when I am being me. Being Barbara, having skin like this really pays off." "That it does. Thank you for explaining." A few days after I had started to wear the jewelry, Nate and I set out in his camper van for the fishing spot. On the trip to the fishing spot, I was a little worried. I knew that at the place we were going, we were to meet up with Nate's male friends and their wives. I was worried that I either wouldn't be accepted or else would be read as being a fake. In the end, I need not have been worried. When it came to Sarah, Susan, and Eden, they all accepted me. I quickly found that each of them had been friends with Candace, but none of them seemed to want to shed light on what had happened with her. In fact, the only mention of her by name seemed to come with a sense of displeasure with it. While most of the time spent at the fishing spot was uneventful, the second last day proved more interesting. That day was very hot. As such, we took a break from what we were doing. We women stopped playing cards, and the men stopped fishing. Rather than that, we all took to the water for a swim to cool ourselves down. I was really glad at that point that the makeup I had used to make myself look old was waterproof. I was also glad that the false breasts I now had were glued to my chest. In fact, my biggest worry was my tuck coming loose. Having spent most of the afternoon splashing about in the water, Noah and the other men finally got out as the sun started to hang low. The reason for that was so that they could start cooking the massive dinner that they had planned for the final night of us being there. As for us ladies, well, we decided to stay in the water a little longer. It was as the sun was going down that I finally decided to leave the cool water. As I did so, I saw that Noah was looking directly at me. I could also see that his eyes were open wide and his mouth had gone limp. Seeing I was worried that something was wrong, I happened to look down. I couldn't see anything. All I could see was my wet skin shining slightly in the late afternoon light. Nothing more was said about why Noah had reacted the way he had, and soon after that point, dinner had gotten underway. Come the following morning, each of US couples went our own ways. However, before that happened, each of the other women directly told me that they hoped they might see me again. They hoped that we could become better friends than that week had allowed. Knowing at that point that I had been accepted by elderly women as an elderly woman in my own rights, made me feel so giddy. On the drive back home, Nate didn't say much to me. I just put that down to the fact that he was one of those drivers who solely focused on the road while driving. When we had gotten back to his house and I had helped Nate to park his camper van, I followed him into his house. No, not in a creepy way. As much as I loved wearing the jewelry that I had, I knew it was time to give it back to him. Wait! Nate said just as I was about to remove the earrings. Wait? I asked. There is something I need to say. Okay? Yesterday, when I saw you coming from the water and I saw the sun shining on your skin, I knew the truth. The truth? That I want you to become Barbara for real. I want you to stay as my elderly girlfriend. I will even help you in any way I can to become Barbara, and my ideal girlfriend. That idea made my heart rush like never before, and I knew why. It was because it excited me. No, more than that. It was what I wanted, what I had wanted for most of my life. It was what I had wanted since my mother had made me spend too much time in the sun and my skin had ended up looking older than it should have. Seeing what Nate was suggesting was what I wanted, I quickly accepted his offer. Moments after I had accepted Nate's offer, he kissed me on the lips. With that action having happened, I found that I liked being kissed by him. That led me to wonder what else I might like to do with him. Of course, anything else would have to wait until I was much more of the woman that I was meant to be. Late that evening when I finally went back to my house, I did so still wearing the jewelry that I had been given. That's right, seeing we were a couple now, Nate had decided that the jewelry was mine. He called it a down payment on my lovely future as a delightful old granny. Nate really didn't waste much time in coming through on his promise to help me. Just over a week after I had agreed to become Barbara, he took me to a doctor that he knew. Dr. Williams, as I came to know him as, was an older man. In fact, he was about the same age as Nate. I guessed the two knew each other. Soon after we had arrived, Dr. Williams started to explain how some older women like myself needed hormone replacement therapy, once their bodies had become unable to make the correct hormones on its own. Before I could fully come to terms with what was going on, I had been given a prescription for 2 sets of medicines. I would found out later on that one of the medicines was a male hormone blocker, while the second one was a type of female hormones. Having learned that the tablets were hormones, I quickly worked out that Nate and Dr. Williams had bypassed the normal process. They had gotten me on hormones without all the normal checks. Not that I was complaining about that. In fact, I was so thankful that I kissed Nate. Kissing him was something that I still enjoyed, and something that now felt totally natural. When it came to correcting my body, which was what Nate and I had decided to call the process of fixing it so that it was the body of a woman, we ended up deciding on a top-down approach to the process. As Nate and I spoke about what needed to be done to fix my body, we decided that my face was the first thing that we needed to deal with. There were 2 reasons for that. One of them was the fact that my face and the makeup I used was a weak spot. It was something that could fail and give me away for not being the mature lady that I appeared to be. The second reason was simply that both of us wanted me to look right as quickly as possible. In the days that followed, I did a lot of research. What I ended up finding was a clinic that claimed they could do what I wanted. They claimed that they could make a young person look old. They claimed they could do it, even if it went against the convention that young meant beautiful. Soon after I had made contact with the clinic to find out if what they were claiming was true, I also found out that they could fix my hair. They could change my brown hair, which I dyed into real gray hair. With the phone call out of the way, and me being fairly sure that the clinic was telling the truth, I went to see Nate. When I told him what I had found, he became very happy and told me that he was willing to pay for the surgeries right away. It was less than a week after I had spoken to Nate that I booked into the clinic. The process of healing from the work that had been done to my face and scalp took a long time. However, once I was healed, both Nate and I liked the change. As he put it, I now had the perfect-looking elderly female face. It was still very pretty, while also having deep lines and wrinkles in all the right places. The moment I saw my new face, I knew nobody would ever question my age. Of course, my face wasn't the only change. The clinic had managed to do what it had said it could do. They had managed to replace my own hair with lovely gray hair. My new hair had been cut into a feminine gray bob cut that went back behind my ears. The reason for that was so that everyone could see my shiny new hearing aids. "You look beautiful," Nate said moments after he had kissed me. Being told that made me blush, but at the same time, it also made me really happy. Just a few weeks after I had gotten my new hair, we had another meet-up with Nate's friends. Seeing they had brought their wives along, I got more of a chance to get to know the women who would soon be my friends. Sarah, Susan, and Eden all agreed on one thing. I seemed different to the first time we had met. I seemed more radiant, or at least that was how they put it. I just giggled as I told them that being Nate's girlfriend really suited me. That wasn't a lie either. I loved everything about being his girlfriend. I loved spending time with him. I loved going on dates with him. The truth was, I loved everything about being with him. It was sometime during that day that I found out that we were all from the same city. My new friends even explained to me that once a week they met up at a local sports club for a round of cards and to talk about their men. The reason they told me was simple. They had decided it was time I joined their little circle. Soon after that day, I started to spend each of my Friday nights with my lady friends, and there was a side effect to that. Being around other elderly women gave me a chance to better understand myself as one. As such, slowly I became even more of an old lady than I already was. It was over dinner one evening that I informed Nate that I was more than ready for the next stage of correction for my body. The next stage being for me to get breast implants, of course. With my own breasts having started to grow, and with the false forms having started to get old, I really needed to do something. I think he also wanted me to get breasts of my own because he longed to once more touch real breasts. When it came to my breasts, I had decided that Nate could pick what size and type I got. That way we both would get what we wanted. I would get breasts of my own, and he would get a woman with his dream breasts. The breast implants that Nate ended up picking gave me a set of breasts that were like a slightly saggy set of watermelons. They were larger than the false forms had been and much more bouncy as well. When I was fully healed, I found that I really loved how my new breasts looked and how they felt as well. Cupped in a shaper, a bra, or a corset, they felt wonderful. It was clear I wasn't the only one who liked my new breasts. I could see by the look on Nate's face that he totally loved them. Seeing my new breasts were something that I could show off, I started to wear what one might call slightly more revealing clothing. Thanks to the corsets and shapers that I had been wearing for so long, I had the curves to go with the breasts. That being the case, Nate still did mention something about a desire to enhance my curves. At the time, he never elaborated on what that meant. The first time that I met up with my friends after I had gotten my new breasts, they looked me up and down. It was Susan who asked the big question. "Have you gotten new breasts?" Susan asked. "I have," I responded. "Well, they look good on you." "Why, thank you." With that, the other women all agreed. At that point, I knew the cat was at least partly out of the bag. My female friends all knew that I was changing my body for Nate. I guess I didn't mind them knowing, as it didn't seem to change anything between us. It was around a month after my breasts had finished healing that Nate started to take me to an old-time dance that was held each Saturday night. I was a bit nervous about that, as I didn't know how to dance. What I found when we got there was that all my lady friends attended the dance with their husbands. You know, Eden said when the two of us had a moment alone. Considering what this place meant to Nate and Candace, for him to bring you here must mean that you have become his world. How do you mean? I asked. I mean that you have managed to replace her in his heart. Really? I think so, yes. I didn't know if that was true. Nevertheless, the thought of it secretly made me happy. That night as I learned to dance, I knew that I felt so safe and so contented in Nate's arms. The simple truth of the matter was that I didn't want that night to end. Of course, it had to, so that better things could happen. The only real bump in the road during that time of my life was when my parents unexpectedly came for a visit. I wasn't expecting them as we weren't on good terms, and they weren't expecting to find a crusty busty old lady living in the house that they knew their son should have been living in. When push came to the shove, I didn't bother to tell my parents the truth. I didn't want them knowing. I didn't want this new life of mine ruined by them in the same way they had ruined my old one. Rather than that, I just suggested to them that their son had moved on long ago. With that, they were gone and I was happy again. It was about 2 months after the visit and 2 months before my birthday that Nate gave me a birthday gift. I was a little confused by that. My confusion ended when I found that the gift was a certificate for implants to help shape my lower body. In other words, butt and thigh implants. By the time that I was totally healed from getting the implants, it was almost my birthday. I guess that had been Nate's plan all along. That night, as I stood there looking at my reflection in the mirror, I knew that everything I had endured had been so worth it. At that point in time, everything about me except for the shrunken little thing between my legs looked like that of a curvy old granny. Okay, so I will admit it. I looked like a curvy old granny who had taken good care of her body over the years. I was still sexy by younger standards, and I knew it. As fate would have it, the first dance that Nate and I attended after the work had been done happened to happen on the night of my birthday. That night I happened to wear a very low-cut blue gown that really showed off my new body. When my friends first saw me that evening, they were shocked. Soon after the shock had passed, they made a joke about the fact that my renovations seemed to be going well. They were right about that, so I didn't mind the joke. Later that night, as Nate and I took to the dance floor, I knew that my body was the envy of most of the men there and some of the women as well. They either wanted to be with me or else to be me. It wasn't as if that was going to happen. I was a one-man woman. It was at supper time, when the dancing had passed so that we could all mingle and have some refreshments, that Nate made the last move that I had ever expected from him. Having gotten down on one knee in front of me, he took a diamond ring out of his pocket, and he held it out so that I could see it. "Barbara Brown, would you marry me?" Nate asked in a shaky voice. "Yes," I responded loudly, knowing the answer right away. "Yes, I will marry you." Soon after I had said yes, Nate slipped his ring onto my finger, and once that had happened, the two of us kissed. I barely even heard the sound of the cheering that was coming from the people around us. All I could hear was the beating of our two hearts. Sure, deep down I knew where the ring I now wore came from. I knew that it had come from the finger of Nate's former wife. The thing was, I didn't care. It wasn't a big deal for me. For me, it was what the ring meant and not where it had come from that mattered. So what else can I say? By the end of that night, that wonderful night, I was engaged to the man that I loved, and it was just the most wonderful feeling. In the weeks after that night, and without me knowing, Nate started work on another big project for me. It was something that I only found out about when it was done. So, one might be wondering what this big secret project was. It was to get me the documents that I would need to live as my true self. By the time that Nate was done, I found that I had all the documents that I would ever need to confirm that I was Miss Barbara Brown. The documents even proved that I was a 66-year-old woman. Much to my shock, I even found out that Nate had managed to get things like my home and the bills that I needed to pay switched over to my new identity. While part of me did want to know how he had managed all that he had, I decided not to ask. I felt it was better that way. With my new identity in place, I worked out that at that point, there was only one trace left of the man I had once been. It was the trace that was between my legs, and I wanted it gone. When I told Nate that I dearly wanted my penis turned into a vagina, he seemed really happy. He directly admitted that he wanted his future wife to have a vagina of her own. Still, it took us weeks and weeks of research to work out how to make that happen. In the end, Nate had to take me overseas to a country where the rules were more relaxed. A place where money spoke and not the documents that we didn't have. About a week after we had arrived in said country, I went under the knife to finally have my penis turned into a vagina. I would later learn that while that was happening, all Nate could do was wait at our hotel room hoping that nothing would go wrong. When I finally woke up after the operation, I was groggy and sore, but at the same time, I knew that the deed had been done. My own penis was gone, and the only one that would come near the new hole between my legs was Nate's. Knowing that my penis was now finally gone made me happy, as I knew that meant that all that remained was Barbara. All that was left was the old lady that I was going to be for the rest of my life. When I was recovered enough to do so, Nate and I flew back home. It was soon after we had gotten back that the two of us started to plan the final stage of my transition into Granny-dom. It was 3 months after Nate and I had gotten back from overseas that the two of us were married. I have to admit that I think I made a wonderful-looking mature bride as I stood there in my rather traditional wedding dress waiting for the ceremony to start. When Nate and I had finished the ceremony, and I had signed the documents that legally made me his wife, we quickly headed off to start our honeymoon. We had decided that for our honeymoon, we would travel around the country as a pair of gray nomads. As Nate and I hit the road in the afternoon sun, I happened to look down at my engagement ring and my wedding bands. In that moment, I knew that deciding to become Barbara was the best thing that I had ever done. The simple truth of the matter was that I was happy in a way I had never been before, and this was just the start. After all, this was just the first day of our wonderful life as husband and wife.